we'll start with some questions among our audience, and also let our presenters ask questions of each other as well. So don't feel inhibited to do that. I jotted a few down on my notes, but let's open it up and see. Do you have some comments or responses or things that we'd like to start it off with? Yeah, please.
I just have a technical question for Ron Paricio. So if you could finding those tripod spots is just fascinating to me. And as you did so, and as you lined everything up and did the geometry and so forth, were you then able to calculate, or did you already know, the focal length of the lenses that were used? Sorry, that's a nerd talking to a nerd, sorry.
I was not after the focal length. And the reason being is that at the time that I was doing this, there was an academic argument as to whether both Russell and O'Sullivan were there or only A.J. Russell. And so my goal was to go up and document. I had copies of as many negatives that I could find and the photographs. I wanted to find the location. And then I said I took survey equipment with me. Basically, I wanted to measure the information, the angle of the image that was taken, and as well as obviously GPS location and this type of thing. But knowing the angle would determine the lens. Since I had O'Sullivan's negatives, which were smaller than Russell's, I knew the negative sizes. The focal length could be calculated, but I was after, okay, if I was given an image, you know, and I knew the angle, was this taken from O'Sullivan's camera or Russell's camera? And so I was very quickly, I found out that Russell's large plate camera had a wider angle lens than O'Sullivan's, and it reversed for the stereos. And then I went to locations away from this area and that I had their images and took those same measurements so that I could verify, yes, this is Russell's camera, this is O'Sullivan's camera. Basically what I came up with is that there are at least 5 sets of lenses being used. O'Sullivan's camera was large enough that his the large plates were small enough that he could take both the plate, or he would take the holder, put 2 lenses on the front and use the same camera body and use the stereo. That's why I say I'm not counting cameras. I gotta count lens groups. And what I found was there were clearly 2 sets of stereo lenses, 2 sets of plate lenses, and there's 1 image that was taken with a slight telephoto lens. And we think that one of them, probably O'Sullivan, was working with Charles Savage, who was the local representative of Anthony. Anthony was the New York dealer that provided photo bodies, chemistry, lenses as a dealership, basically, for people to use. So I've got to believe that both Russell and O'Sullivan were getting their supplies through Savage. There are images by Russell and O'Sullivan with Savage in the images, so we know there was interplay between the photographers. And so the one lens I haven't been able to figure out is this slight telephoto, and it has no foreground in it, and I'm moving around for a long time trying to figure out where that one was taken, because every other one, you've got a rock in the foreground, you've got something mid-ground, you got a mountain in the background, you can start lining them up and say, okay, the tripod is here. This one I couldn't do that with. So in a way you can get to the focal length from what I was measuring, but I was after really determining the number of sets of lenses. And from that, it's my conclusion, and most people that I know that have looked at it since then, they're in agreement that both Russell and O'Sullivan were there at that that period of time.
My question's for Elizabeth, and good to see you again in this venue. You know, there's this term in the study of tourism called the tourist gaze. And I wonder if there is some kind of connection or genealogy from the scenes that these photographers set up and later photographic images by tourists. And I'll just say I took my grandchild to Yellowstone last summer, and it's not always easy to find the right spot to take. But were these people and their views, I assume, were they somehow influential in what later becomes tourist photography of these national parks?
Thanks, Susan, and it's so good to see you too. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are in many national parks, you know, designated photo areas, and there's Moran Point, you know, in Yellowstone. So there are clear references that some of the places where they're encouraging you to take a picture are exactly the places where photographers or painters in the past stood. And you know, in the very early photographs of Yosemite, for example, I think that those first visitors, Charles Weed, Edward Muybridge, Carlton Watkins, are absolutely setting an itinerary. And in fact, it is an itinerary that then turns up in the guidebooks. So, and then the guidebooks are illustrated by their photographs. So the Yosemite book from 1869, you know, has a picture at all the stops. So I think this absolutely does this. But they're also, I mean, I loved the, I think it was Shannon who showed the Caspar David Friedrich, the Rückenfigur. You know, these things certainly predate. And as I said, you know, Talbot really said the whole reason he wanted to come up with a camera is that he was in Switzerland and he couldn't draw as well as he wanted to, and he needed a better way to have a souvenir of his trip. But already the conventions of certain kinds of compositions, I mean, Gilpin as well, right? William Gilpin in Great Britain, also connecting the making of views with the touristic experience and capturing that permanently. So, so these pictures of people looking at the landscape or portraits in landscapes, as well as some of these views, I think have a long prehistory to photo. But yeah, we're still doing it. Instagram maybe is going to let us change things up a little, but there's a lot there that looks very, very old. Hmm?
This is more of a comment than a question to Chip. I'm really glad that you brought up silent movies, because I think, Shannon, you showed the painting of the Brudeferd i Hardanger, the bridal party in the Hardangerfjord. And there's a silent movie from 1926, The Bridal Party in Hardanger, which I was lucky enough to see last year when it was shown at the film festival in Tromsø with an amazing group of musicians creating kind of world music to this very national romantic movie. And it's filmed partly in Knut Knutsen's home farm. So one of the photographs in the exhibition, which is called From Tokheim, is one of the locations for this film. And I was lucky enough to sit in on your introduction to the film Sami Blood. I'm going to go home and watch Sami Blood. And if you haven't seen Bridal Party in Hardanger, you should see that one.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the recommendation. I'll make a recommendation for Elizabeth, too, just since we're making film recommendations now. Well, I'm really intrigued by your observation about the way that this photograph is about participation in the landscape, because it runs counter to the kind of tourist view that Susan is setting up, where it's usually at a distance, right? Mm-hmm. It's the view of, and you see so many of these in the tourist guides, actually, where you're being set up in a position of mastery mm-hmm. of the landscape in different sorts of ways. I think that might be a little oversimplification in some ways, because obviously you have to get there, and there's complication. But the film I would recommend to you is, it's called, the English translation is The Outlaw and His Wife. It's a Swedish film from 1918. And it caused quite a stir when it came out, in part because it was about showing these kinds of landscapes. But the whole gist of it is that Victor Sjöström, who both stars and directs it, it's supposedly set in Iceland, although it's actually filmed in northern Sweden. But it's all about the individuals, this tension between these beautiful views up in the mountains and really spectacular landscapes that are being filmed very much as a kind of a tourist perspective, but then the embeddedness of these characters in this landscape that sometimes overwhelms them. And one scene in particular that, they were rolling and they must have said, just keep rolling, is he's cooking his dinner in a hot spring. And so he's kind of like close and cooking it, and it starts bubbling up more and more and more and more. And you can see him kind of look at the camera at one point like, do I keep doing this or not? And it's this wonderful kind of moment that you get sometimes in silent film where they just kept rolling, to do it. But where his embeddedness in the landscape is what kind of keeps coming out, and that's what's being captured. So these two tendencies that we see in the photographs are being played out kind of in this narrative film.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump to Leslie and the Sami and the reindeer herders who made their way from Norway to Seattle. And I'd like for you just to kind of, I remember trying to find the newspaper articles about that and figuring out how maybe we could include it in the show or maybe we could include it in the book. But my understanding, and this is where I'd like for you to clarify, is that they took the ship from Norway to New York, right? And then the railroad across, is that right? And kind of made stops. And I think there was a freight car with the 500 reindeer, and that the local newspapers kind of reported along the way. Is that right? Do I remember correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
This is also for you, Leslie. Anders B. Vilse is considered, the best, the most prolific. He's the most famous Norwegian photographer ever. Even though coming from the collections in Bergen, it kind of hurts me to say this because our hero is Knut Knudsen. But you did an amazing presentation about his work in Seattle, which isn't very well known in Norway. In Norway, we know about what he did in Norway from 1900 till his death in, I can't remember, 42, is that right? Yeah. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about his position in Seattle and like among the other Seattle photographers of that time, if you'll.
Yeah, I think that he had a position that was comparable to Curtis. He was really, you see his name in print, in local newspapers throughout that period in the late 1890s. Also, the significance of the bicycle map that I referred to, that shouldn't be underestimated. He is a very significant person because of the period that he captured. And there's a tremendous amount of, how prolific he was, but there's such rich holdings at Mohai, at UW, and we're lucky to have a smaller collection, but at the National Museum as well. So I think that he was pretty tireless when he committed to commercial photography in 1897.
Can I just add to that? Leslie, what happened to his company that he was setting up in Seattle after he never came back?
So it remained in the hands of his employees until 1913.
And I wondered too, this is just a separate point, but I loved those bike pathways that he was, those photographs. And it seems like there could be some interesting comparisons between what he was doing with bike pathways and what Knutsen was doing with the roads. And is that just a Norwegian fascination? Or, I don't know if there's another American photographer that was doing similar kind of, that was equally fascinated with those sort of pathways. I don't know if that's a sort of open comment, but just interesting observation.
And can I just add that later as well, he would describe working as a photographer in Norway with his camera equipment and biking through Norway. So this is not something he did just in Seattle. And on skis, yeah. But he had smaller cameras than what Ron has been showing us.
Yeah. Just yesterday, gave a very different presentation on an exhibition that we have right now at the museum from the Sweden's National Museum of painting rather, in the 1890s. And the first image that I pulled, I needed an image of Fritz Taulau painting on plein air and to photograph. Elsa.
One of the speakers, I think it was maybe Elizabeth, mentioned that during the 19th century, geology was really popular amongst lots of Americans. And it's interesting that in 1925, the Scopes monkey trial brought that to the evolution in geology into the, notoriety. And geology basically disappeared from consciousness in the country. And it was taken out of high school curriculums. It was once one of the major topics of study in high schools. And it was just eventually got taken out, and college courses disappeared. And this was just part of the culture wars going way back then.
I think you're right. And, Ron mentioned that the surveys were a decade after Darwin. And I think one of the important reasons why geology was so exciting in the 19th century was that people were trying to figure out the story of creation, right? And then science got to a place where the story of creation and the story in the Bible had a lot of trouble melding. And I think that, geology was already beginning to kind of separate from the popular imagination, become a more specialized study by the last quarter of the 19th century, because reconciling these things was, maybe less easy for people to just read in a Time magazine style article.
Extraction industry, important part of the
100%, right? But the extraction industry, what I love about reading the surveys is the belief that that geology is visible on the surface, right? So you can go out and you can kind of see where a silver field's going to be just from really looking closely, right? So the skills that the naturalist had and the skills that the artist had were really hand in glove. Now, of course, we do it with all kinds of, sensing that is superhuman. And so this kind of image making and representation is much less important.
We so appreciate you sitting and so patiently participating and engaging with these conversations. Just as I will, since our time is nigh, I will forego long closing remarks, but just give a hearty thanks to all of our presenters who have come far and wide to come share their expertise with us. We're so grateful, and we would invite all of you to come talk more to our presenters, to our co-curators, and to please go visit the exhibition again. These talks we've been recording, and so we will post them later, and we would encourage you to share them as well, so that more people can hear these talks in the future. So we'll get those kind of edited shortly, and hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll be able to post them. And I think this has been so enriching, and so many ways of entry into these 19th century photographs. I think they live large still today and give us insights both into the past, but I think also make really powerful connections to us today. We had a really unique opportunity with some of our presenters to go on a field trip to the Spiral Jetty yesterday. And, again, it was it's a pilgrimage, it's a bumpy road, we're experimenting out in the landscape, tasting the salts, getting dirty, taking photographs. And I think photography and the land continues to be a love affair. And we can relate a little to these intrepid 19th century photographers even today. So I think we'll conclude with that. Let's give a big thanks to all of our presenters again. Thank you so much.